If you've been in the Christian world long enough, you've probably heard sermons that bash the idea of following your heart. Because, as Jeremiah 17:9 rightly says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So there's truth to that, especially in light of the way that our culture conceives of the heart as any desire or emotion that bubbles to the surface. But Proverbs tells us that the problem is not in following our heart, but rather what or who our heart follows. The scriptures portray the heart as the seat of the will, the place of our deepest allegiances. Conversion happens when God's grace switches the allegiance of our heart away from sin toward God. That's regeneration. That's what it means for His law to be written on your heart. That's the place where your deepest loyalties are secured. And that place must be occupied by God alone. So if that's true of your life, then by all means follow your heart. Because if your heart follows God, then it will lead you toward worship. It will lead you toward trust. And it will lead you toward obedience. That's the heart of Proverbs. This is Understanding Proverbs. I'm going to continue my running commentary on Proverbs by looking at chapters 16 to 18, based again on George Schwab's outline in his Proverbs commentary. I'm going to loosely follow it, but drawing from other sources as well. And as always, I encourage you to take note of any Proverbs that I mention that grab your interest and spend some time meditating on those Proverbs throughout your day. Let's start in chapter 16, the first 9 verses, talking about the ways of God and the ways of man. The Christian life is filled with many complex philosophical questions. How do we reconcile free will with God's sovereignty? How do we understand the presence of evil alongside the goodness of God? And Christians throughout the ages have written thousands of books dealing with these questions. Yet Proverbs tackles these tensions with striking simplicity and almost ease. It's the kind of advice your grandfather gives on his front porch that, although not technically sophisticated, somehow makes complete sense of life. Look at verse 1. The plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. We really do make plans, but ultimately God determines the outcome of all things. There's no contradiction between our choices and God's sovereignty. In fact, there's a harmony. That's how it works. It's how we have to live life. If we thought that all of our fates depended upon our decisions, well, we would be paralyzed. But if we thought that God's sovereignty left no room for us to make genuine choices, well, then we would have no moral agency. And yet our experience of life seems to sense that these two things are true, that they're side by side, that there's a harmonization that we may not be particularly aware of, but nevertheless rings true. And that's what this proverb captures. Nothing escapes God's sovereignty, not even our hidden motives, verse 2. This actually allows us to commit our work to the Lord, verse 3. Literally roll it away onto God and trust Him to provide the outcome. You focus on the next play without worrying about the scoreboard. Verses 3 and 4, God's sovereignty is over the good and the evil, right? He makes everything, even the wicked, for the day of trouble. That's not saying that God made evil, but rather the evil that is in the world cannot help but fulfill God's intended good purposes. Again, it's not meant to explain every nook and cranny of this philosophical tension, but to give earthly advice from the ground up to help us live life in a skillful way. God's sovereignty also ensures final justice. The arrogant and evil in heart will face God's judgment, but those who conform themselves to God's redemptive purposes will be transformed. The redeemed people of God are those who are marked by steadfast love and faithfulness. That's the pathway of redemption. That's what it means to be a Christian, that you have these things as fruit from the new life that God gives you by His grace. They fear the Lord, and so they turn away from evil. They're empowered by grace to live in a way pleasing to God, which brings a life of peace with their enemies and contentment. Fearing God fundamentally changes our value system. We want righteousness more than wealth and justice. We want wisdom more than profit, and we want God's purposes over our own. So when we order our plans according to God's priorities, we should expect Him to establish our steps, to make them firm. God is far more willing to act than we are. He's the one who's faithful. We're the ones who are unfaithful. So when we align ourselves with his purposes, his moral will, as explained in his word, we should expect him to make our footsteps firm, to make our path firm. There's also a royalty to wisdom. In the next 6 verses, verses 10 to 15 of chapter 16, there's again this connection between the king and wisdom. The king of Israel represents God the way an adult son represents his father in the family business. He reflects his father's rule and his character in an appropriate way so that the whole nation either suffers or finds blessing. So the king, if he's going to be righteous, if he's going to represent the rule of God, he can't make sinful judgments. He's got to ensure that there's no financial corruption under his reign, verses 10 to 12. His righteousness manifests primarily in the way that he speaks. He speaks truthfully and with integrity. He surrounds himself with trustworthy people. Think about how David's reign suffered because he entrusted himself to Ahithophel, who ended up betraying him. Who we surround ourselves with goes a long way in determining the outcome of our life. So we need to choose our inner circle very wisely. Kings must exercise both strength and gentleness. If he's too weak, if he's spineless, there's no security. His people are fearful. His wrath must terrify evildoers, and his strength must compel respect from his subjects. But his face must also bring life, favor, and refreshment, like clouds that bring the spring rain. In other words, good, strong leadership, righteously informed leadership, brings blessing to everybody. The mark of a righteous king's reign is joy and the service of the ultimate good. Wisdom is all about seeing the world correctly, making proper value judgments about the things around you, and understanding what really matters in life. Our eyes are what direct our feet. Our feet follow our eyes, which means that what captures our eyes, what captures our attention is going to direct the way we walk. It's going to direct the paths of our lives. So the wise man is going to set his eyes on wisdom. He will value wisdom over riches, and that guards him from veering off the upright path into that of the crooked. Wisdom sees that though pride and arrogance may for a time elevate your status, it might give you a little burst of happiness. Ultimately, they're stepping stones not to success, but to ruin, destruction, and a devastating fall. So a righteous man, a wise man, is going to maintain his humility, even if that means being alongside the lowest in society, the poor, rather than compromise his integrity and split great wealth with the proud and arrogant. Above all, the wise person blesses others through his words. He's persuasive, not through emotional manipulation, but discernment, rooted in his trust of God and his ways. He's got good sense. And people around him take note. He embodies a life of blessing, and it spills out in generosity toward others. When we take our words and we think about them and we utilize them to bring life and blessing, we give the most compelling apologetic for wisdom. People see not only does it work in our lives, but it actually blesses their lives. The proof, again, is in the pudding, that we embody wisdom and we bring that blessing to others. By contrast, the fool leaves destruction in his wake. In verses 25 to 30 of chapter 16, we see that the fool, who's described as perverse, wicked, and violent, he brings death to everyone around him. And at the core of his life is self-deception, right? He's somebody who he thinks he's right and everybody's wrong in every situation. I heard a saying once about someone's grandmother, she ain't always right, but she ain't never been wrong. Well, with all respect to grandmothers everywhere, that's what Proverbs is describing. Somebody who assumes that they're the smartest person in the room, who avoids counsel, which ends up leading him to death. But the righteous, they use words to bring blessing and wisdom and truth to others. But the wicked speak like a scorching fire. It spreads strife. It separates close friends. He brings the whole neighborhood with him as he makes dishonest plans and works toward evil ends. There's a splash zone of destruction around his words, and you want to avoid him at all costs because his words are weapons aimed at the lives of those who are around him. Well, how do we stay on the righteous path? How do we stay on the path of wisdom? Well, you have to look at the outcomes of those who came before. Gray hairs show the fruits of wisdom, a righteous life well lived. It's a crown of glory. It's something that you see at the end of someone's life. Their wrinkles, their gray hair shows that they lived life well. They did things according to the wisdom of God. And you can see it in the fruit of their life. There's nothing like hearing the hard-earned wisdom of a couple that's been married for 50 years. We all want parenting tips from mothers and fathers who raise outstanding young adults. And that's why we look to the older generation for wisdom, and that's why we pay them so much respect, because they have tested these truths and found them to be true, and their life demonstrates that. It's a walking billboard, a walking apologetic for wisdom. What is one priceless nugget of wisdom? Well, older generations would probably tell you self-control. A man who controls his anger finds more strength and might than a conquering king, verse 32. But this only happens when we recognize God's sovereignty over every lot that's cast and every decision that's made, verse 33. The fear of the Lord allows us to see beyond superficial appearances. A household with fine wine and gourmet food may seem more alluring than a family gathered around a simple meal until you realize how messed up and dysfunctional the rich family is, verse 1 of chapter 17. A rich heir seems more favorable than a diligent servant until you find out that the father is going to reward the wise over people of his own bloodline, verse 2. God tests our hearts through both blessing and affliction in order to reveal what's inside. Verse 3, are we going to listen to the wicked and mischievous, or will we look down on the poor and find joy in the misfortune of others? If we do that, then God is not going to be mocked. We're going to reap what we sow. He's going to bring judgment because he cares about the poor and he cares about those who suffer. And we are mocking God when we mock those kinds of people. Verses 4 to 5. The righteous who sow wisdom reap generational bounty for their descendants. And children are going to honor their fathers because they're so grateful for this inheritance. That's verse 6. That's what we want to do. We want to pass the blessings down the line to future generations, which means we have to be diligent in applying this wisdom to our own lives and instructing the next generation in that wisdom. We get some more instruction on the fool in verses 7 to 26 of chapter 17. We see more of his destructive nature. He lacks discretion and tact with his words. He gets what he wants through the magic amulet of bribery. He spills secrets to destroy the reputation of friends, and he refuses any correction. A wise man gains more from one rebuke than a fool does from 100 punches to the gut. He just doesn't get it. Verses 7 to 10. Stay away from these fools, because they're after rebellion. And if you try to correct them, they're going to attack you, like a she-bear in a forest trying to protect her cubs. Stay away from them. They're irrational. They're vicious. You don't want to get caught up in the company of these fools. Verses 11 to 12. The fool returns evil for good. His moral instincts are inverted. He doesn't fear God. Verse 13. He instigates division, but never knows when to stop, until finally the dam bursts and his whole life is submerged in foolishness and in the wrath of other people. Verse 14. But even over that, God reigns. God reigns over all, even the unrighteous judges of the earth, who justify the wicked and condemn the righteous. Verse 15. Even if a fool bought wisdom, he wouldn't know how to use it. Verse 16. True friends stick around in the hardest of times, verse 17, but fools bring division, dishonesty, and sorrow to their parents, 18 to 21. He accepts bribes, he perverts justice, he sets his eyes on the ends of the earth rather than right in front of him where wisdom actually is, and he spurns the inheritance of wisdom from his mother and father. Despite all the channels of wisdom that flow toward him, he runs in the other direction toward his folly. You see this deep shame. He brings disgrace on his family, and his family, they are just beside themselves. You can see that with parents who are just distraught over the foolish choices of their children, that they refuse to listen to that wise instruction, and they just head straight toward their own ruin. This leads to another section punctuated by the phrase, whoever, ... 17:27 to 18:7. We have in these whoever passages a general list of wisdom for living skillfully in God's world. So the wise man is one who speaks the least and keeps his head because his words carry the greatest impact. In fact, even a fool who applies this to his life, who just stays quiet, is going to seem wise in the eyes of others. There's a social tact involved. There's nothing to lose with speaking less and remaining calm. In fact, there's a lot to gain. There's a lot to lose when you isolate yourself. The fool isolates himself, and he breaks out against sound judgment. He hears the advice of others, or rather he ignores the advice of others, and he just goes with the right way in his own eyes, and he ends up leading himself into ruin. If you isolate yourself from good instruction, from counterpoints, from trusted, wise friends, you do that to your own peril. The fool loves the sound of his own voice. He's always spouting opinions and hot takes, but he never gains understanding. Verse 2 of chapter 18. All this does is heap contempt and disgrace upon his life. A man's words are going to reveal the depths of his heart. And if those depths contain wisdom, then that wisdom is going to bubble up out of him through his words and nourish others and bring justice and righteousness. Verses 4 to 5. But a fool uses words not only to ruin his own life, but to ruin the lives of others. His lips bring a beating upon him. His mouth gets a beating because he's using his words, instigating strife, and he gets punched in the face, right? I mean, maybe you know people like this. They need to be punched in the face, right? Maybe not literally, but maybe metaphorically, they need to be humbled. And the fool, he just doesn't get it. He doesn't see the feedback he's getting from other people on the stupidity of his behavior. That's what the fool is about. And at the heart is this self-deception. Again, he doesn't understand himself, he doesn't fear God, and he doesn't get the world. He is fundamentally irrational. Now, again, his heart is twisted, and chapter 18, verses 8 to 20 deal with issues of the heart again. You need to keep your heart from craving the delicious morsels of gossip. Verse 8. Maybe you felt that, right? There's something tantalizing about gossip, something that just really draws you in. You get to be part of this inner circle, as C.S. Lewis talks about. And it gives you this momentary high. But you have to resist that. You have to resist that craving, that desire for this morsel that is ultimately going to be poisonous to you and destructive to others. Don't slack off in your work. Verse 9. Entrust your heart to the Lord. He is a strong tower to the righteous, rather than wealth is to the rich. And instead of envying the rich for the wealth that they have, that's their security, instead you should say, I have a greater security because the Lord himself is my strong tower. Remember that destruction follows a haughty heart, but humility leads to honor. So speak humbly. Listen before you give a rash answer and embarrass yourself. Maybe you're talking to somebody and you just cut in and you say something stupid and you realize if you had just let them talk a little bit more, you would have better answered their question, or you would have had a better understanding of how to speak to them. So don't be foolish. Listen before you give a rash answer. A heart that trusts God will endure sicknesses, but without such a foundation, the spirit is crushed. An intelligent heart is going to apply his heart to know and practice wisdom, not just hear ideas or play with abstract thoughts. Verse 15. In other words, wisdom navigates society well. Wisdom knows the value of gifts in gaining an audience. Wisdom thinks about things from multiple angles, from different people's perspectives, and he uses tact to avoid offending a brother and causing unnecessary conflict. He can de-escalate a situation. He keeps a cool head and uses his words as a vehicle of blessing, not division and strife. And his wise use of words bears the fruit of a satisfying life. If you can master your tongue, like the book of James speaks about, your whole life is going to follow. Because self-control of your words is the beginning of self-control over your entire life. We've got some concluding thoughts in verses 21 to 24 of chapter 18. Proverbs wraps up with these basic bullet point ideas. The tongue determines life or death, so use your words prudently. Verse 21. A faithful wife is a blessing from God. Verse 22. That's self-explanatory. The poor entreat, they beg, they ask for mercy because they're dependent upon mercy. But the rich, they give rough answers to people because they're self-sufficient. But the rich have a harder time of understanding God's grace and mercy, whereas the poor, that's their way of life. And that's the way that we should be as believers, recognizing that everything in our life comes from the gracious hand of God, that mercy should be second nature to us because we are dependent upon mercy ourselves. Finally, friendship is such a valuable gift. Having one loyal friend is better than having all these Facebook followers or Instagram followers or this whole host of companions. If you have one loyal friend who's like a brother, who's going to be with you through thick and thin, that is more valuable than all of the fawning masses around you. And that's something that is also a gift of God and something we should cherish. The gift of friendship, the gift of a good wife, the mastery of our tongues, which is mastery over life and death, and the way that we understand the mercy of God are all pillars that we build our Christian lives upon. And from those principles, everything else sort of follows. And so as you reflect on some of these proverbs, consider, where are you tempted? Were you tempted toward gossip, toward slacking off? Were you tempted towards getting off the straight path toward crookedness? And what are some ways that Proverbs entices us and motivates us to stay on the straight path? with seeing the outcome of our life, seeing the outcome of the lives of others who have gone before and the blessing and satisfying life that they live. Think about those real life examples as a way to keep you on the straight path.